Hello and welcome to the Telltale Cake, where we tell tales with cake and we try to ignore the corpses under the floorboards. With me today is my dear friend Erin, security expert, who will be finding all the corpses under the floorboards, dancer, gamer, nerd, equestrian, pianist. How are you today, Erin?
I'm doing wonderful, thank you. How are you, Beth?
I'm doing well. So what are we reading today, and why are we reading it?
So today we are reading and discussing The Power by Naomi Alderman. And I wanted to discuss this book because the very first time I read it was at a trying time in America's history when a certain individual was up for election who maybe should not have been. And as a woman, it was a very stressful time. Somebody else told me about this book in which the women gain a new power that allows them to deal with patriarchy, if you will.
Love it. This was published in 2017, which was indeed a very trying time in our country. It is still relevant. It is especially relevant with the women life freedom movement in Iran. And also the fact that we are still having a trying time for women in this country.
Yes.
How is life like as a woman these days?
You know, I wouldn't want to be anything other than a woman. However, there are definitely some downsides. And particularly when it comes to the clash of patriarchal values versus being a woman and feminism in general, it can be pretty exhausting. And I tend to think of myself as a relatively peaceful person. I like to resolve conflict with as much grace and empathy as possible. However, you know, when you're bludgeoned enough with something, you build up some resentment towards it and occasionally think of reacting in a similar way. And that's kind of what ends up happening in this book.
There is definitely some feminist wish fulfillment here because I have wished before that men would experience just once things like what it's like to be afraid to be in public, what it's like to have their bodies just discussed in a very insulting way on national TV. I want men to experience that.
I definitely relate to that. And as I mentioned, like most of the time, it's more of that just desire to have that understanding so that theoretically there could be some empathy and possibly, you know, some restraint with some of their actions and thoughts. But at some point, you know, you have that just like visceral desire to be like, you know what, let me make you understand this. So I can definitely see that wish fulfillment in this book.
It's like, I will teach you empathy with a hammer.
Or, in this case, electricity.
Speaking of, for this book, I made a Blitzkuchen, which is German for a lightning cake. Now, I don't really read history, so I don't know anything about Germany other than the musical Cabaret. So when I hear the word Blitz, I just assume we're learning our Bob Fosse routines very quickly.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
So this is just a basic coffee cake. It's something that you can throw together very quickly. I don't know how well this is going to turn out. I've made this before, but this latest time I made it, I misread the recipe and I ended up putting way too much butter in it. So I don't know how it's going to hold together with that much butter. But I decided not to remake it because I feel like in this case, butter is a little bit of an analogy or an allegory for power. You think you want it and you think it's good, and then you just get way too much of it and it becomes a problem.
So we keep referencing the whole lightning aspect of this. And essentially, that's what ends up happening in this book is a vestigial or something like that organ starts appearing in women, which then gives them the capacity to essentially be like an electric eel and send out shocks of varying powers. And this becomes a type of potential weapon that gives initially women the power to end up defending themselves. But it starts developing into more of that as well.
And speaking of lightning, although I take back what I said, the amount of butter in here is fine. Therefore, you can have as much power as you want.
I approve.
Let's talk about this book and judge it by its cover for a second. So I really like the cover art on this.
It's interesting how they went about like actually constructing it from my perspective, because they took like the, I don't know, chakra lines, I don't know what you call them, but and like the vein patterns, and then actually put what looks like lightning into them. And hands play a big part in this because this is more or less how the women control this power that they accrue. And it's referenced in a couple of different ways throughout the book as well. So I feel like it's a very good image for the book.
Yeah, I have no notes on this. This is great. This relates to the book. It's visually appealing. It's got some interest. I like this. This is probably the first book where I've been like, I really like the cover art.
And it's not like overwhelming or anything. It's very simple. I think it speaks well to...
It's effective.
It is. Mm-hmm.
There's another cover that I've seen, which I think is influenced by the TV show that has been based on this.
Oh, okay.
Which just shows the different characters, and I don't love that nearly so much.
Yeah, I can understand that, because I feel like, I mean, obviously the characters are an integral part of the book. You can't have the book without them. But I think this does a better job of conveying the primary focus of the book, which is the power in and of itself. And then the characters are just there to explore what could be done with that power.
The illustrator of this, by the way, is Marsh Davies. So good job, Marsh Davies. We like you. At least we like your work. I'm sure you're a lovely person. So there's a little bit of a wrapper script. Before we even get into this book about how they've got the power, it opens with a foreword or a prologue where the person who has written a manuscript is writing to a publisher, editor type, talking about his manuscript, which is, of course, this book. And we learn that it's sort of a retelling of some creation stories, some foundational historical events. We're going to learn that it's largely an attempt to reclaim slightly a very matriarchal story. Last month on this channel, we discussed The Red Tent, which is an attempt to reclaim a very patriarchal story. So I find it very amusing that we're going to try to do the same thing satirically. And
the wrapper script, as you called it, which I did not know that's what it was called.
I took an English class in college.
I did too. I apparently do not remember anything.
Actually, that might just be a computer term. It might be a wrapper narrative rather than a wrapper script. Either way it works.
It's
a wrapper.
It is a wrapper. And it's persisted kind of throughout the book with what feels to me like reviewing historical artifacts, essentially. It references a lot of different like statues, as well as I think some like literary pieces that were written at the time. And then it is actually concluded at the very end of the book. So, which I think we might get into that last sentence later on.
The last sentence made me laugh out loud, genuinely. So hard.
But so it does initiate with this discussion from a male writer to a female, I think, like you said, editor, publisher, somebody that would be in charge of actually approving a type of manuscript or something like that. And so it's not really indicative in the beginning of like the extent of what has happened in this like alternate universe Earth, or who knows, maybe it is our future. That would be kind of nice. Or it might not be. We'll discuss that. But I think it was a very interesting way to start the book. I read this initially, and then I listened to the audiobook of it the second time around when I was making sure that I was on the up and up for this conversation. So it was a little bit different how it was portrayed in the audiobook, which the audiobook is very good. I tend to be picky about my audiobooks because if somebody has a voice that I don't care for, I can't manage it. But and I don't recall who the narrator was for this one, but they were good. Good job, whoever the narrator was. Apologies that I don't remember your name. But it was an interesting way to start off the story, and it doesn't quite prepare you for what you're going to get into, but the whole book itself, I feel, is kind of a slow burn, which makes sense because the book is called The Power, the women gain this power, but it's the ability is kind of analogous to the actual power that they start having in society. And so, I thought that was a great way for it to start out.
As you mentioned, what's happening is that women are gaining the power to exude electricity. There's some sort of weird sciencey bullshit explanation for this. Who cares? The point is they've got this organ that's starting to develop called a skein. Like thread, like Erin.
I do like that it's like, it's like yarn, because women always knit or crochet or whatever. But yes, it's called a skein. I
actually do knit and cross stitch.
I mean, I crochet, so it's a thing.
We're womanly.
Very womanly. But it is an organ which they speculate has possibly always been there. But they start seeing it initially. I think the chapter might be called The Day of the Girls, or there is a reference to The Day of the Girls. But it starts appearing mostly in younger teenage women, and it's an organ that develops across their collarbone. But they start feeling the ability to basically build up a charge and send out a shock. And what's interesting is that these young girls have the ability to actually spark this power in older women. So it's like it was there in waiting, and then they can actually pass this ability along to other women.
It's also an interesting reversal because a lot of times we see this stereotypical, grandmother characters, maiden, mother, crone, whatever, and the crone is the one passing on wisdom to the new maiden generation. But in this case, the maidens are awakening this killing power in the crones and the mothers.
That is very interesting. And I kind of wonder if that was done intentionally as an additional juxtaposition along the patriarchal values are passed on from father to son. So I wonder if it's just an additional role reversal of women now having the power and doing it instead from a younger age group up to an older age group.
That's a good segue into talking about some of our characters, because the first one that we meet really is Roxy. And Roxy's a mafia princess. It's not quite the mafia. It's organized crime, but not Italian. And she's one of the earliest to get the power. She's also one of the strongest. And she actually does try to break the cycle of violence. As we find out, it doesn't work out so well for her.
Which
it's unfortunate.
It's very unfortunate. Do we want to discuss her full story first, or do we want to kind of keep the timeline as the book goes?
We'll keep the timeline. So we'll introduce all the characters, and then we'll talk about when they all come together and what all goes on.
But when we are first introduced to Roxy, she has a bit of a tragedy befall her, and of course, in the traditional mafia princess style, her father is not married to her mother. Her mother was the other woman, and tragedy befalls her mother. So that's how we initially meet her, and I believe that's when her power wakes up, is actually while this is occurring. Roxy is there with her mother when her mother is being attacked, and she's not quite able to defend herself in this situation.
She's basically Bambi here.
Yeah. I mean, if Bambi could, zap somebody horribly, but still have to watch his mom die.
I think in the book he does grow up to get into fights with other deer.
I have not read the book. I actually did not know that. I had always presumed that the book was made as a companion to the movie and not the other way around. Was it made first?
I'm pretty sure. Well, you know how Disney takes everything and makes
yes.
it less weird and terrible?
Yes. Grimm's fairy tales in general.
And Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales. So, yeah, grown-up Bambi does get into some violence.
Good to know. I respect him a little more now. What does that say about me? Anyways. But yes, so that is Roxy R. We'll go with Mafia Princess, even though I think she's based out of London.
And she's not Italian.
And not Italian at all, yeah. Is there a London Mafia? Is there a London Mafia equivalent?
Organized crime with a Cockney accent, which I cannot do. Can you do a Cockney accent?
No. I'm working on that one.
We won't even try then. And this happens in pretty much our first chapter, which is ominously titled like 10 years to go. All of our sections in this book have incredibly ominous headings. 10 years to go, 8 years to go. Something bad is happening. We're not being subtle about the fact that something is going to happen.
Definitely a constant sense of foreboding, but it's almost odd because, if you can imagine like a sudden change taking place all over the world for half the population, more or less.
Slightly more than usually.
Yes, but at the same time, it didn't happen to all women.
True.
So it
Call
was
it a quarter of the population.
Yeah,
maybe?
we'll go with that. And then gradually increasing. But this was happening everywhere all at once, and nobody really knew how to react to it. So it was affecting all of our characters in slightly different ways depending on where they were and.
Well, actually, before we move away from Roxy, she grows up kind of in the family mafia business, and she gets into it. They start making a drug that will help women have more power. It's super fun.
Yes.
Roxy gets to murder the people back who murdered her mother. Mm-hmm. Has a good relationship with her father, maybe, sort of, and her brothers.
She has a very interesting relationship with her father, which, as we progress through this, I'm sure we'll discuss more. But, initially it seems like a very good relationship, which possibly gets taken advantage of later on, which, still speaks to the traditional dynamics between men and women, I feel. And honestly, I do feel like Roxy is probably one of the better examples for temperance, even though she is one of the most powerful women, but how she ends up using or not using her power later on. Now, granted, she does go through some trauma with her power as well, inflicted, of course, by a man. So that, it has some effect to it. But even before she goes through this other experience, the way she chooses to use her power, I feel is much more judicious than a lot of other people.
I agree. Though there is somebody who's very judicious and very thoughtful about how to use her power, and that is Allie. Allie is a foster kid who's being abused in a religious home because that happens. Mm-hmm. She kills her foster father in the midst of some very sexual abuse and runs away. And then she starts a cult, like you do.
I mean, why wouldn't you?
It's definitely the right move. She sets up in a convent, starts her own cult. Yeah, Cthulhu. And she actually learns how to use her power in very subtle ways, not just to shock people. She can do some basic healing sorts of things because the body works on a lot of electrical signals. So if you send an electrical signal in just the right way, you can make stuff happen. Of course, she's going to use it for faith healing. Why
wouldn't you?
Which it really helps with your cultist cred.
It does. And who's to say, faith healing is just based on the belief in an individual to channel some sort of power, which is what she's doing. So, actually, Allie, who later goes by Mother Eve, I believe.
Mother Eve.
Mm-hmm. Which, ironic. But she reminds me a lot, to bring this to a completely different genre, of Cora, from, or excuse me, not Korra. Oh gosh, what is her name from Last Airbender?
Katara?
Katara, thank you. One of the other Ks. There's a part where Katara ends up doing blood bending. And it actually reminds me a lot of Allie because, Katara ends up ultimately realizing very rapidly for the sake of the series that you could use this for a lot of malicious intent. And more or less elects not to go down that road. Allie, on the other hand, does not generally use her power for what would be typically considered malicious intent, but along with doing some like faith healing type stuff where she does actually help people. She has also found the capacity to manipulate thoughts, essentially, because your thoughts are just electrical impulses over your brain. And if you just tweak them slightly, you can just nudge somebody towards another direction, which is another thing that she finds out how to do. So
she's a great cult leader is what we're getting
she's
at.
Really good. She's great. However, another characteristic about Allie, which is throughout the majority of the book, the only person that has this, is she has a voice speaking to her. Which it's never quite clarified where this voice is coming from. If it is some actual god, goddess,
Entity.
higher power, or if it is some form of very strong schizophrenia with only one pertinent voice. So throughout the book, especially as she's starting to learn her power, this voice is kind of guiding her along what she should be doing and how to go about it. So I thought that that was a pretty interesting dynamic because it does kind of make it feel like it is an otherworldly thing that is happening to her.
And we should also mention that one of her major motivations is she wants to be safe. Remember, she's an abused kid. And she recognizes, with the help of her voice, that one way to be safe is to be in control of everything around you. Now, this may become a problem later because the problem with power is that power in itself does bad things to you.
And I think especially because, Roxy has this like great capacity. Allie is really powerful in her nuance, as you had mentioned. And, that whole like ultimate power corrupts ultimately sort of thing. And that she is so good at being able to wield it to manipulate the circumstances around her that I think that that's eventually what gets her to the point of like, questionable whether or not this is, morally correct.
One of our more morally correct characters would be Tunde. He is our token strong male character.
Yes.
He's also going to be the victim and target of a lot of sexual violence in this book as the token male character. There's a missed opportunity, I think, in the other cover photo for this book that shows all the characters. They should have shown the token male character in the stereotypical token female character, where he's standing to show both his chest and his butt at the same time.
It should also be mentioned that Tunde is very attractive.
Yes.
Which, I think is perfect for this book where it's literally taking the stereotypical misogynistic view of the other sex and applying it completely in reverse. So you have all of these women whose appearances, while they are mentioned occasionally, are really kind of written as men's appearances would be in the traditional sense, whereas Tunde is described as being very attractive, very flattering. Later on in the book, once things have really started swinging the other way, he is lusted after quite heavily by many people. So yeah, he is the typical. You say strong male character, but
He's the trope of the strong female character.
he is, yeah. So when we say strong, we mean
Black Widow in the Avengers.
Yeah, yeah.
So tight leather.
Although,
Or pleather.
man, I wish they had put him in that at one point. Army fatigues are discussed, not in relation to him, but in general about being very provocative. And there are some points where his, bare chest is discussed at length and how distracting it is, which, all of us women are constantly doing that now. So...
Like I said, there is some feminist wish fulfillment. Men should know what it's like to be discussed in terms of their bodies and how they look all the time.
As their primary characteristic, no less. And, it's very interesting later on because towards the latter, I'd say really third of the book, because I feel like it doesn't go like extreme until pretty later on. But that's really all they're discussed as is like, they're just there for breeding. And like, how many of them do we really need? They're dangerous. They can't be trusted like on their own. Anyways, so the whole strong thing is more an analogy to what you were saying was like a strong female character would be currently.
Mm-hmm. And Tunde's actual job in this is that he's a journalist. He happens to get video of one of the first known uses of the power. CNN picks it up. He becomes super YouTube sensation. He ends up going around a lot of places and seeing important events. He ends up being in the kingdom of Saudi Arabia when the women there revolt and basically overthrow the king and murder a bunch of men.
As you do.
As one would do in Saudi Arabia.
But he I feel like his character is there to provide that male perspective and also give us a window into kind of like the international event of how history starts being altered insofar as like the younger generation are giving this power to the older generation, which enables women to essentially throw off all of these other shackles of oppression in whatever society that they are in. So he gives us kind of the non-biased view of how events are unfolding.
Right, because men are always unbiased and logical.
Yes, of course. Yeah, completely non-emotional, just facts.
Totes. No, one thing we learned from the rapper narrative is that this manuscript is giving Tunde much more of a role than he would normally have in this foundational story. So he is our reclaiming the matriarchy narrative. He's a man who does the important things. So we've been talking about a lot of children or younger people here. Tunde's not very old. He's maybe young adult.
I was going to say, I think he's like early mid-20s is my impression. I'm not sure that they ever discuss his age exactly.
They really should have.
But he is portrayed as a very, again, attractive and virile man. So he is of marrying age.
Fair. We have an older character, Margot Cleary, and Margot is a U.S. politician. She starts as just a mayor, and her daughter, Jocelyn, is one who has the power, though Jocelyn has some problems with it. But Jocelyn awakes the power in Margot. And Margot goes on this interesting political journey, and we get to see a lot of political changes in the U.S. through Margot's eyes. When the Day of the Girls first happens and the power is first known, the U.S. immediately takes an abstinence-only approach to telling girls about their power, which made me laugh, because of course the U.S. went abstinence-only, because that has always been demonstrated to work very well with developmental things.
Yeah. The initial reaction to girls getting this power is there's something wrong with them. We need to control it. Mm-hmm. So initially, girls are like quarantined when they are found to demonstrate this power. They encourage people to tell if they have seen a girl use her power. And I haven't seen the entire show, but I have watched a few episodes, and in one of the initial episodes, they actually have them like separated in a gym, and they're all in like isolation chambers, essentially. And I feel like that's a very apt, analogy for how, and being from the U.S., I obviously have opinions about this, but how we handle a lot of any women who show anything derivative from what is considered a appropriate social norm. And so, Margot, being an older woman, does not show this initially. But she does find out that her daughter has exhibited this and goes through, having to kind of handle her daughter, especially as a political figure. They have to have perfect families because we definitely have that in the U.S. But as a woman, she is judged far more harshly than her male colleagues. And so they actually do testing and everything for political office because they don't want anybody in political office that has this power because it's inappropriate. And initially, Margot does not have it, but it does end up getting awakened later on. And she actually goes through the testing process and manages to pass the test that says she doesn't have the power. And it's a very difficult thing for her to do, but she manages it, which I find is a great analogy to how women have to manage their emotions more than men because we are so much more emotional than they are. But it is expected of us to have to be able to manage all of these things for the comfort of men.
Do we have the correct tone when discussing this book? Because I feel like speculative fiction about a matriarchy might be upsetting to some men. So
I apologize to any potential male viewer for your discomfort.
But we need to make sure we have absolutely the correct comforting tone for this.
It would be very difficult for you to go through this adjustment, and I apologize for any part that I might have in that discomfort. And I thank you for your patience in while I'm learning to manage this my own self. Was that okay?
I feel like we should both be standing more so that you can see both of our boobs and our butts at the same time, but that's kind of an awkward way to stand.
I've been working on my female superhero stances. I've used a lot of comic books for reference, but I'm still not quite there. So
I struggle with the heels.
It's very uncomfortable. You know what they didn't do in this book is actually talk about any of that sort of male apparel outside of like being slightly provocative. But we didn't go into, there is some sexual stuff later on, but any other body like deforming norms that you have to put on, like the whole like putting, not breaking feet and, making them very tiny, but at the very least, like shoving them into very narrow shoes with very high heels that make it very awkward to walk in and then end up destroying pretty much your entire body. We'll have to add that into like a suggestion list for Naomi, although she is coming out with another book later this year that comes out on November 7th, but it's another story.
I also feel like men should be wearing some sort of butt pad arrangement to enhance some of their natural assets and make sure to have the correct figure for women to look at.
Yeah, there definitely needs to be a bit more of that. I feel like that might have been a missed opportunity by this book. But I suppose we'll have to actually focus on, other things like power and structures of society.
The important stuff, not just sexualizing men. Though speaking of men, Margot's daughter Jocelyn, she has some problems with her power. It comes and goes in fits and starts. And she ends up getting involved with this teenage boy who also has a skein because, shock, gasp, biology doesn't respect our strict binaries.
Yeah, shockingly enough, it does not adhere to there's only two types of chromosomes that you can have, and they are the ultimate rulers of your entire life. Just, I am not a scientist, but I do know that there are more than just XX and XY, which I realize will be very contentious to some people. But despite that, yes, there are a myriad, and they discuss it briefly, but there are actual groups of individuals who are not even this new norm of the having the skein in their power as just women. There are some men or varieties of people who are not expected to have a skein and end up having one. And yes, Jocelyn falls into this. Initially, it was like a support group because she does have these kind of like temperamental fluctuations with her capacity and control over this power that she's struggling with, which Margot does try to like send her to like a camp to help her with it and everything, which is another thing.
Margot actually sets up camps to help girls with this.
She does.
Which are quasi-military that become less quasi as the book goes on. Military-style training camps for girls who have power. What could go wrong?
Well, and so initially it was done, and this was controversial in and of itself because acknowledging that women have this power and then teaching them to use it is ludicrous, right? But yes, Margot ends up setting up these camps because initially because her own daughter does have these issues in managing and controlling her power, which is problematic because if you are accidentally zapping people when you're not trying to, it causes complications.
It's a problem.
Mm-hmm. So that's what these camps are initially supposed to be for. But yes, as part of Jocelyn's journey, she ends up meeting this boy online, and they develop a relationship.
And her mom kind of ends up breaking them up because it's bad for her political career because this boy with a little bit of a skein is seen as like I hate using this word, but it's kind of what they use, so deviant.
Mm-hmm. Again, it's not accepted for women to have skeins, but that is the new norm. But for men...
the horror.
The shock, the horror. Oh, heavens. My fainting couch.
We should have fainting couches in here.
We should. Have to rearrange a little bit.
And what Margot does is she tells Jocelyn that this boy that she's seeing is a member of basically an online hate group because, of course, the U.S. has these hate and terrorist groups of men who promote men's rights and wants to oppress women, which is definitely different from, say, the Proud Boys, who definitely don't do things like that.
No, and they don't march in major cities in places like Texas or anything like that.
Not at all.
It would never happen.
So this is just a wild leap of fiction that there would be terrorist groups of people trying to go back to oppressing women.
Yep. Yeah, that would never happen.
Though Margot does go through an interesting political evolution where she stops having to be your typical female American politician who has to demonstrate competence or perform competence might be a better term for what we make our Elizabeth Warrens and Hillary Clintons do. She gets to a point where she gets to express anger and do things like hit podiums and yell and do things that some of our male politicians just do.
Well, we do have to remember that even though it is inappropriate for women, anger is not an emotion.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So, I mean, it is still really bizarre that a woman would even want to do that. Like, that's just not in their nature. But anger is not an emotion, so it's okay in the political landscape, at least for men. And then it does become more acceptable for her later on.
Speaking of female politicians, sort of, the last character we really need to talk about is Tatiana Moskalev of Moldova.
Ah, yes.
What do we know about Moldova?
Me personally, not a whole heck of a lot.
They have great Eurovision entries. Hey ho, let's go folklore and rock and roll. Such a great song.
God.
They were robbed.
Yeah.
Hej ho, let's go! Folklore and rock'n'roll, Black Treno, Montevideo, Chisinau, Bucharest!
That I actually am familiar with. But aside from that, I can tell you about the character. So she was initially a gymnast, I suppose, and she's actually trying to get on the international team. I don't know if it was for the Olympics. I think something along some sort of like international competitive team. And I believe she's only like 14 or 15 when she is spotted by the ruler. Which do you have his name? I don't rember his name.
No,
It's
he's not
inconsequential.
important. Nobody cares about him.
But anyways, yes, the de facto leader, he spots her and, of course, being a man, says, I want that, and just plucks her from her life, which this is, again, depicted in the show kind of interestingly. And I don't feel like they went over it quite as much in the book, but her mother is very happy about this. Because it is going to afford her and subsequently her family all of this opportunity because she will have wealth and power, blah, 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 because this man chose her. Whereas she is not particularly thrilled about it because she doesn't want to leave her sister and she doesn't want to be with this man who's literally decades older than her and wants to just pursue her love of the activity that she's doing and will no longer get to do.
And this is sex trafficking, and it's why sex trafficking happens. If you can sell one kid to feed all the other kids and the rest of the family.
The greater good.
The greater good. So Tatiana gets the power, and she does about what you'd think she'd do, which is she murders her husband and takes over the country.
As you do.
As one does. Like, I mean, what... Would you be more inclined to take over a country or start a cult?
I can't do both.
You can do both.
I would do both.
Good call.
Yeah. Like, honestly, one just kind of reinforces the other, so.
Just become the God Empress. It's fine.
I mean, what? That sounds perfect, honestly. Goddess Empress. Goddess Empress?
Yes, Goddess Empress. Perfect.
Lots of S's.
So many S's. So Moldova is now ruled by a woman, and it actually gets renamed as Besapara. But there's a problem, which is civil war, because the exiled king of Saudi Arabia ends up in Moldova, of all places. And they have a civil war, and it's very concerning to the rest of the world because apparently there's a lot of Soviet-era nukes still in Moldova. I don't know whether that's true or not. I kind of don't really care.
Yes, for the sake of this discussion, we'll assume that it's true because...
They're probably sure.
Sure.
Are we being ignorant Americans by only knowing about Moldova's Eurovision entries?
Yes. So, to play into that stereotype, yes, I am being very ignorant American. However, I claim to do so for my own sanity because there's enough shit in the world that I don't need to know about anything that is not something that I can affect immediately. So
we now have all of our characters. So let's talk about how they're going to get together and find synergy so they can end the whole world.
So this book was, while interesting and a bit validating in some ways, very difficult for me to read, especially towards the end. But just from like a logistical standpoint of this book, it was a little challenging for me because it is very much a telling all the different stories and then they converge at one point or overlap in various points, kind of technically. But I think maybe the easiest way to start would be with Allie or Mother Eve because, as she's escaping her old life, and I should say, like, she didn't immediately start a cult. Like, she wasn't, like, going out to start a cult. It just happened, like it does.
Some people start cults. Other people have cults thrust upon them.
I wonder if that's in my cards. Anyways, But she does end up accruing a following, between like the various like faith healings and things like that. She gains a presence online and just known internationally, which as Roxy is going through some of her stuff, she ends up hearing about it. And she's skeptical of Mother Eve. Like, I mean, everybody's going to be skeptical of a cult at the beginning of it. It's natural. But Roxy does eventually end up coming to the convent.
Compound.
That Mother Eve is running. So that's where those two stories kind of build into each other.
So Roxy and Allie start hanging out. It really helps Mother Eve to be in good with Roxy because Roxy's selling this neat drug that gives people with power superpowers.
It essentially makes their power even stronger. So it's called glitter, which I love that it's called that because, again, glitter is a very like feminine, but also kind of like associated with like vapidness or either like fun, happy, peppy, like girlishness, but also associated with strippers at the same time. So it's got like this weird connotation to it.
Strippers are hardworking women.
They are. Oh my gosh. And like, yeah. But there's still like that interesting like dichotomy of like this is a fun arts and crafts thing or something that I would like to lick off of somebody's body. So the fact that they have named this drug that essentially heightens all of these women's newfound powers is pretty darn cool.
So Allie is gaining a lot of international power and influence. And one thing this gets her is an invitation to Moldova. Mm-hmm. So she can go bless Tatiana.
Tatiana doesn't come right out and say it, but she's essentially looking for approval and also justification in a way of altering some laws in the country. She's looking for someone to give her credibility and kind of look the other way.
Tatiana is how we really see how getting too much power has made this not feminist anymore. Like, we've gone from wanting equality to wanting to rule the world because that's what power does to people. So she is having these increasingly decadent Roman emperor-style parties.
Yes.
Where men are basically just there for humiliating entertainment and sexual pleasure.
Yes, and Tunde is actually at one of these parties, whereas how that kind of factors in there.
He's covering the war in Moldova.
He's covering the war, but gets invited there and witnesses how women are treating men at these parties. Like there's a point where some like beverage or decanter or something is dropped and the glass shatters, and one of the objects there, one of the men, is instructed to lick it up, and he ends up getting like glass shards in his throat. So Tunde is there and ends up, I don't remember if he took photos, but he did record the encounter, either writing or otherwise, of, what is being done to these men, because he feels it is his responsibility to communicate this to the world. And So anyways, yeah, you get kind of the idea of, these men are purely there as objects of the women's interest, and they are treated in such a way that is pretty abhorrent.
Everybody is now in Besapara/Moldova, actually, except Margot. Jocelyn has been deployed with the North Star soldiers, who are now not quasi-military. They're just straight up military.
Actually, I believe that was one of the things that Tatiana also had requested or not necessarily requested, but had kind of like thrown in as we would like to include this and we could help do that if you guys let us do this other stuff with our laws and how we want to control the men in our society.
And the U.S. is like, sure, because if we know anything about the U.S., it's that we love supplying weapons to other countries.
Yeah.
And usually the worse the regime, the better.
Cluster bombs. Anyways.
Huzzah. So the North Star soldiers are there, and Roxy is there because she's providing Tatiana with glitter.
Yep. And she's also there slightly as a liaison for Mother Eve because the two of them have been, working very closely in tandem. Mother Eve is very grateful for Roxy's power and influence, and then the drugs, of course. And, Roxy has had her way and operations smoothed along by all of Mother Eve's contacts. So it's a confluence of powerful women all sharing resources together.
It's not going to be a beautiful sisterhood forever, though. Specifically, Roxy and Allie decide that Tatiana has just gone a little too far. And it's not that they really have a problem with it. It's just that they're worried about her doing something really stupid. So Mother Eve, very Mother Eve religious faith, heals Tatiana to death.
Yep. Just a little... Initially, Mother Eve's plan is to more or less give Roxy the country, right? She wants Roxy to end up running it for her.
But Roxy disappears briefly. We'll get there in a second.
Yep. But as part of this process, they can't outright murder Tatiana because, that would look bad.
It would.
So Mother Eve does what she does and slowly starts modifying Tatiana's thought patterns and eventually ends up more or less convincing Tatiana to basically give her the country should she pass, by a male assassin or something. So that's what ends up happening.
Yeah, it's Tatiana mysteriously dies. Mm-hmm. Shot gas. Mother Eve has been treating her headaches.
She's been treating her headaches, and she was with her. It's very difficult to run a country, and she had all of these stresses put on her. And before Mother Eve could do anything about it, she just offed herself. So no fault of Mother Eve's, of course.
None.
What could she have done? She had been doing her best to help Tatiana out, and some people just can't be helped.
Correct. So Allie is somehow running Besapara now. And because Tatiana's dead, we have a decree from on high in Moldova that essentially men are now subject to Saudi Arabia women laws. They can't go anywhere without female guardians, their passports get confiscated, all that fun stuff.
Yep.
A bunch of journalists hang out at the bar drinking heavily about this, a bunch of male journalists, and a bunch of them decide to just leave, which I think is perfectly reasonable. Tunde decides to stick it out and just cut across country and see what's happening and document it, and then just cross the border somewhere. Roxy, meanwhile, was going to just go check on her glitter warehouse, which one of her brothers has been running.
A brief history of some of the other stuff that has happened with Roxy. One of her other siblings was offed, mm-hmm. and she was involved in the vengeance aspect of that, and her father does see her worth in how he can weaponize her, essentially. He does acknowledge that she's very powerful. And there's a bit of contention because, first off, she's the illegitimate child. Second off, she's a woman. And what woman inherits the family company? But, the father has been, leaning towards, okay, she's clearly the one in charge here. And so her other brother is just kind of helping run it. He needs to support his sister. But clearly men aren't really willing to let that power go. So they decide to take matters into their own hands.
One other interesting fact is that Roxy learns that her father was responsible for the attack on her mother.
Yes, that happened before. Mm-hmm.
And Roxy decides she's not going to continue that cycle of violence. She's not going to go murder her father. She's just going to exile her father and take over the family business. And all of her brothers will go along with this, right? They won't have problems, right?
No, of course not. Clearly that is something they would be completely comfortable with because and in showing this judicious control and understanding because her father offed her mother because I think she had cheated on him or something like that. Which he could just not let stand because
obviously,
even though she was his mistress, how dare she? So, he couldn't have her make him look bad. So naturally he had to kill her. But Roxy wasn't supposed to be there. She was not supposed to be there. So he was trying to be considerate of Roxy because he loves her. But yeah, essentially he was responsible for it. But Roxy has this compassion. She's like, that's not how I want to do things.
Roxy's genuinely a pretty nice person.
She's a little bit kooky, but yeah, overall, I would say she's one of the genuinely best good people in this series. Because yeah, she doesn't want to continue using her power as a way to control life and death with these people here. Not that she has qualms about killing people, but it's just that's not how she wants to do things. So she does end up saying, making the decision that I am going to let my father live. I will confront him about this, let him know that this is the choice that I have made. You are living by my grace sort of thing. But I'm not going to be like you. I'm going to run things a different way. But unfortunately, she doesn't get to do that for very long.
Her brother turns traitor and attacks her and has a surgeon surgically remove her skein and insert it into himself.
Which the process, as they describe it, is I feel like Alderman does a really good job of kind of describing the horror of because Roxy is awake for part of it, very drugged, but awake. And she describes what it feels like to essentially have her body mutilated and have this essential core part of her removed and how horrifying it is. So the skein is then transplanted into her brother, which that is a whole other thing. But in this process, Roxy manages to escape because these surgeries are not normal, obviously. While they are having complications trying to put this new organ into her brother, she manages somehow to basically break free and runs away.
This is where she actually encounters Tunde, who is also sort of running through the woods in Moldova, trying to get to the border, because things have become increasingly violent and unhinged between civil war and oppression of men. And he has had this awful experience where he tried to get in contact with his editor at CNN. And it turns out that his editor has just sort of announced that he's dead and taken his life's work and published it under her own name.
Which I almost admire in a way. Not that that's a good thing. You should not plagiarize or steal somebody's work. But the fact that there have been so many women whose life's work have been taken over by men, it's again one of those wish fulfillment things of you know what? You get it now.
Yeah, it's like Watson and Crick stealing the work of, and I'm so embarrassed I can't remember her name right now. But, yeah, and getting Nobel Prizes, and she got nothing for a long time.
Yeah.
So it's awful. It's a terrible thing to do, but it's at the same time. So we want to see a man experience what this feels like.
And, he is kind of horrified. Like, obviously, he's been seeing all of this stuff develop. So it's not new to him. It's not shocking. But the fact that he has been pronounced dead, like he reaches out to multiple colleagues and they reply back with like, this is a sick joke. How dare you pretend to be my departed friend? So he essentially realizes he has no lifelines. Like he is alone in the world. And he it has been more or less captured by another like cult-like thing that's going on there, where he has seen, these men being essentially sexual sacrifices to this cult of women, is captured by them and is literally in a cage when he wakes up and finds that Roxy is in this area as well. I think she's a bit drunk at the time. And
which seems like a reasonable response to what she'd just gone through.
Oh, yeah. She's still it has been, I think, a few weeks, possibly a couple of months at this point, because she's healed enough to move around. And she still has this influence because people do more or less know who she is. So they just kind of let her exist around them because, it's like some famous person. And just like, yeah, sure, you can hang out, at our bar. Why not,
Yeah, it's like if Keanu Reeves showed up and didn't have a wallet or anything, like you'd probably just let him hang out.
I absolutely would. Although I hate thinking about Keanu Reeves in any sort of association with this because he is just too wholesome and pure.
He is too pure for this.
Because, that's I'll get to this discussion later, but that was a very difficult thing for me to cope with is like women being like this. And we are all people, right? We all have darker, sides and tendencies, but the thought of women doing some of these things just created this amount of cognitive dissonance that I still can't quite get over.
Women as the perpetrators of this really brutal sexual violence and also non-sexual violence, yeah, it is rough. And one of the thing, it really does show that power is a bad thing to have, and also that in order to see women as fully human, we do have to acknowledge that women can do really terrible things as well. Let people be villains. Like, it's as bad to idealize people and think they can't do bad things as to think they're only capable of doing bad things.
Yep.
Maybe not quite as bad, but
just depends on how you look at things. But yeah, the whole pedestal thing.
The other satire that I've read about women running society is Charlotte Perkins Gilman's Herland, which is very nice. But there's also no men in that society, so women are just nice. There's no power struggles between just women. And I think that story lacks the teeth that this has. And one of them is that it does idealize women so much that, if women ran society, everything would be perfect. No, if women ran society, we would just have some different problems.
Yeah. But to get back to the plot for a bit, the interaction. So Tunde, it's interesting how they end up describing this because Tunde, it says explicitly that his thought is that he has to be his most charming that he's ever been in his entire life to convince Roxy to help him. And I appreciated that reversal of roles of, how women find themselves in dire situations. And the only thing they can do is whatever they possibly can to convince a man to help them.
Mm-hmm. Just smile and be pretty and don't make them mad. Mm-hmm. So that's what Tunde is doing here. And it does work.
It does.
He and Roxy do escape. Roxy goes back to her glitter warehouse in the woods and finds her workers, who are all still on her side. And they, slightly before she can get into her brother, her workers kind of stomp him to death.
He had taken it upon himself to test out his newfound skein, which he has finally, recovered enough and, tried to use a couple of times with a bit of success. And now he wants to use it to be violent against a woman. The woman actually being
Jocelyn. who has found this drug warehouse that she's going to bust as the American soldier.
As you do. And he wins that fight. And he's very proud of himself, but he finds that the women of the warehouse are not so pleased with him.
They don't like it.
They don't like it, and they decide to show him how much they don't like it, and it is a particularly graphic scene.
He gets basically ripped apart and stomped to death.
Yes, and when Roxy comes back, the women there are they're like kind of proud of themselves in a way, and they lead her to, I think, a cold room where she basically finds this mutilated pile of body parts, and her skein is among it, and it is, this was not preserved in any way. Whether or not it's a cold room, it's just probably so it doesn't smell as bad. But she basically sees this integral part of her and what had given her essentially all of the power that she had just laying there dead. So, obviously, she probably has some sort of feelings about her brother being dead, but it really focuses on the fact that the thing that he stole from her is now permanently lost.
So she's done. She is going to just go back and find her father and do something, which we'll get to in a second.
She does go and talk to Mother Eve as well.
She does go talk to Mother Eve, and she talks about what's happened. And this is when Mother Eve sort of realizes something about how to make the world safe for her and all women, which is what her voice has been telling her the whole time is, you can't get there from here. Mm-hmm. Which leads Mother Eve to the conclusion that she should just burn it down and start over. Which, again, this is a thought that I'm sure we've all had. We should just burn it all down.
So, again, it's kind of interesting here because it uses Roxy's character as this more, temperance sort of soul who, especially now that she has now lost her power, essentially. Because she comes back to Mother Eve and is like, I'll still run that country for you if you want me to. And Mother Eve's like, who would follow you? Because
she has no power.
She has no power anymore. And in this conversation, Roxy realizes that Mother Eve is not that sort of like hero that she thought she was, because she does want to just burn everything down. And Roxy's like, well, you're crazy. Like, that's not what you should be doing. But Mother Eve essentially dismisses her, and she's like, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. What are you going to do about it? But I do feel like that is really the, kind of dichotomy with, a powerless woman and this new version, this new alternate universe version of woman who does have all of this power and influence, and the two kind of combating each other. And essentially, Mother Eve wins.
Mother Eve wants to burn it all down. Now, unfortunately, we also have some other people who want to burn it all down. Margot, she's either president or something close to.
She became the senator of her state, I believe. She won that election, and I think that she's going towards president.
She has a lot of power. She's got a lot of influence. She's just received word that her daughter is very injured, possibly dead, in Moldova.
Yep.
So, and this is blamed on, I believe, either the North or the Civil War or something. Anyway, this makes her want to burn it all down. Mm-hmm. Of course, we have the exiled king of Saudi Arabia, who is in the north of Moldova, who wants to burn it all down. Mm-hmm. And remember that minor plot point we brought up, Moldova has some old Soviet nukes.
Yes.
The U.S. has tons of nukes. And we also have some terrorist groups in the U.S., like the men's rights groups, who want to try to burn it all down. So basically, everyone burns it all down. And the last scene of this narrative is Roxy hanging out with her father on a beach, just sort of waiting for the end.
Yep. They, I honestly, I relate to it so much. And it's so interesting because, I come from a family where my relationship in my younger years with my father was not a good one, and we only really reconciled much later in my adulthood. But I do feel like it's very relatable because, Roxy has gone through this like huge developmental like shakeup between, the world changing drastically as well as her own self changing drastically as well as her family dynamics changing drastically. I mean, it's obviously complicated because she's mafia princess, but yeah,
mafia princesses have feelings and family dynamics and problems too.
Yes, I didn't have that whole like, drug cartel part of my life. That wasn't part of it. So I can imagine that was complicated as well. But yeah, I do find it to be very relatable because, I do have similar conversations with my father at this point about like where the state of the world is. And yeah, they're like sipping Mai Tai, just being like, well, this is what it looks like. So, because essentially at that point, neither of them have any power or control on anything that's going to happen at this point. And they're just kind of waiting to see what's going to happen.
The final thing is we get back to the wrapper script where the publisher person is replying to the author. And this is when we learn, okay, this is somehow these events were what started the world over in this matriarchy. And there's just some general comments. And it ends with the publisher suggesting something. I know this might be very distasteful to you. But have you considered publishing this book under a woman's name? I laughed. Like, it's been such
so perfect.
It's such a rough read at the end, and then to get back to there, because even now, a lot of women will publish using just initials because it's known that authors with male-sounding names sell more books, like everything else being equal. There's studies on this, and so I actually know to target women authors by looking for initials. Like I've been reading something by V.E. Schwab, for example, which is quite good.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in my industry right now and having the name Erin, since I work in a male-dominated industry, many times I will just be referred to as Erin, and they will assume that I'm a man, and I let them because I usually end up having more credibility to them if they don't know that I am a woman. So I can definitely relate to that. So I really appreciated the irony of that statement.
So that's the power. It is now time to rate this on my unitless system that means nothing.
Can't wait.
So we have a sugar scale. The S stands for sexiness. Tunde's hot.
Tunde is hot. And there are a lot of references to, men as sexual objects. I think I mentioned there's one point where they, I believe it's in the wrapper script where they're discussing whether or not this history is real, right? Because they're like, well, women have always had this sort of power. It's never been any other way. But they were talking about a bunch of men in army fatigues, and that wasn't actually what happened. That never existed. That was just there as like a woman's sexual fantasy. Like, clearly men would never have done this. And it was only by a woman's design that they would have ever worn these outfits that are clearly provocative. As far as, like, did I feel this was a sexy book? Not really. No. It was, part of it, that whole cognitive dissonance thing was, like, it was difficult for me to read because, I don't think that I overly idealize women at all, but I do find it very difficult to accept that women would be this vile and reprehensible as they become in some areas of this book. And so to me, that's a huge turnoff.
The U is for uniqueness, which I'd say this is a very biting satire. It's got a lot to say. Using women to treat men the way men treat women really it has all these very shocking scenes.
And I feel like they're written in a way that the purpose wasn't the shock, although that is the intended, consequence of it. But it was there to really make you think, not for, the graphic nature of it. So overall, yeah, I would say that this book is pretty unique because I think there have been, some interesting like interpretations of what a matriarchal society could look like, but it's never been like the entire world as far as I've seen. Like I'm thinking back to the Dark Elf societies of Icewind Dale and Dark Elf trilogy, and they have a matriarchal society, but it is done in such a way that it's clearly written by a man. Like it is these sexy women using their goddess powers to have sex with men, and
if a major thing in your matriarchy is how sexy all the women are, it was written by a man.
It was written by a man. So I would say that yes, this is a very unique take, and it's definitely uncomfortable, but I feel like it's more of like the emotional mental discomfort rather than like the words being I don't know if I'm saying that.
We're not just fridging people.
Yeah.
I mean, well, we do, I guess, literally fridge Roxy's brother. But he kind of had it coming. He
did have it coming. Like, honestly, and actually that's a line they ended up using, not for him in particular, but just, the, like, well, what was he wearing? Like, clearly he was asking for it if he's going to walk down the street wearing that. So the whole he had it coming thing. Although now I've got that song stuck in my head. The whole
he had it coming.
Yes, yeah. Chicago's, what is that?
The Cell Block Tango. The G stands for gender. This whole book is about gender relations. It super passes the Bechdel test. There's a small subplot that wasn't really worth talking about for the synopsis, but I kind of love it. We've got some of the plot and the world events driven by these scenes with these two news anchors. Like, as we know, like, there must be a male news anchor and a female news anchor for all the things. And we see the female news anchor go from the quieter one who just kind of laughs and agrees with Tom and covers the fluffier things like cooking, to a complete role reversal where Tom just kind of laughs and agrees with her while she talks about the hard political stuff and he talks about the fluffy human interest things.
Yeah.
So we can see how the world is changing just by what the anchors cover and how they cover it.
You know what? Honestly, that part got kind of glossed over for me. But yeah, thinking back on it, I really appreciate the subtle way that they really conveyed like the overarching narrative there.
A stands for axiness. Franz Kafka says that a book should be an axe for the frozen sea inside us. It should disturb us and make us think about the world in different ways. This is definitely disturbing.
It's so disturbing. We've mentioned the whole cognitive dissonance thing several times, and that is not something that I use lightly because I have a great power for like suspension of disbelief and everything, and there's very few things that like really make me question because I can just kind of accept them, but boy howdy, this one. It was very uncomfortable.
This took me on a journey from feminist wish fulfillment. Like, yes, it would be nice to do some of these things. It would be great to make sure men experience this to, oh, damn, this is bad. Yeah. This is not the equality I was looking for.
Yeah, it definitely evokes horror without that being like the overwhelming, sense that you get from the book. But I would say just the right amount, maybe a little more, to really make you question, like, yikes, is this really how it would be, So definitely high on that scale.
Finally, we have the R, because I can spell sugar, readability. And, of course, you listen to this, but it's the same deal. I think you mentioned there's a little bit of a struggle because at some point there's a lot of things happening all at once, but we keep seeing only pieces of it from various characters. And also it's just there's a lot of really rough sexual violence scenes.
Yes. I would say having gotten through this book, I think 3 times now, both in print and audio versions. I definitely was able to pick up on more stuff and develop an easier understanding, having gone through it multiple times. I would say the writing in and of itself it's very easy to read through. Like, you're not going through a whole bunch of like loquacious, floral paragraphs to get through. But the content is, it gives you pause as you read it. So I would say that there are a lot of uncomfortable scenes, and then, kind of having to piece together the different stories as they're going on. I would say as you're reading it, just know that there will be, like 4 or 5 different storylines in the beginning that will eventually overlap and converge. But just kind of accepting that and not like trying to put it together and just kind of letting it happen would make it probably more easy to read.
It's worth it, but it's not the easiest to get through.
Definitely.
Is how I would go through that. Erin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to share this book. Like I said, it is a very uncomfortable read in a lot of ways, but I appreciated the potential insight into, a foray of what power would really be like.
You're fine. Somebody else just made me read a book on apartheid South Africa.
Oh, boy.
So
well,
I'm in that headspace.
Well, then this was a nice little nightcap for that, I guess.
Is there anything you would like to exhort our readers to do?
Have empathy and be a good person.
If you have power, use it responsibly. Don't do this.
Yeah, there's be a Roxy in a sea of Mother Eve's be a Roxy.
I think we can go with that. Thank you, and like and subscribe.
Thank you.